This week we're going to look at objects. Objects are a more complex data type than what we've seen before with like numbers and booleans because they can actually have multiple values. We call these values properties, and the properties themselves have values. So, for example, this dog object has 4 properties: name, weight, breed, and what it loves to do. And we can use these properties pretty much any way that we can use a variable. So for example, we can pop an alert box with dog.name. And notice we use this dot notation to reference the dog object and then to reference the specific property that we're looking at, the name in this case. In fact, you can pretty much do anything with an object that you can do with a variable if you use the dot notation. Here's a little more complicated example of a student object that has first name, last name, and several other properties. So we can use the student.id property, the student ID, and we could use the birth date, the year of the birth date, or we could use the classes array. Notice that this object actually has as a property another object. Birth date itself is an object because it has its own properties, and it also has an array. So objects can be pretty complex. We'll start off with the not so complex ones, but you can pretty much access any element of an object using the dot notation. In fact, you can set property values just like you can in a variable in an assignment statement. So here's our student example here. If we start this little piece of code by popping an alert box with student.id, it'll output that value that it was initialized with. If we then assign a new value to that property and pop another alert box, it will reflect the changed value. So you can pretty much use a property wherever you could use a variable as long as you use the dot notation. Let's look now at how we actually create these objects. Now the book is going to show you 3 ways to create the object, starting with the simple version, and then the complicated version is the one that we really end up using most of the time. If you look at the top of the screen here, this is what we call an object literal, because it's sort of like hard coding a name for a string. Name equals Bill, because we provide all of the properties and we provide the specific values that we're initializing them to. And then we put all of that inside of a pair of curly braces to say this is an object, and these are the properties of that object. And then we initialize the hotel variable as a reference to that object. One other thing to notice is that this object can have a function also. When objects have functions associated with them, we call them methods. We'll come back to that in a little bit. We can then use the elements of that the elements of that object. So for example, we can reference hotel.name in an assignment statement. So that's one way to create an object, is by using this object literal notation. The second way is to actually create a new object using an object constructor function and then add properties to that object. So in this case, we've created a new object. Notice we call this constructor function in a special way. We use this new keyword to tell JavaScript that we're creating an object and that we should use this as a constructor function. And then we add the properties by doing assignments. So we add a property called name simply by calling hotel.name equals park, and so on. So that's a second way to create an object. Now the way that we often use is actually a little more complicated, which And we do that by creating a custom constructor function. And the reason we do that is because if you're dealing with a lot of hotels in this case, you don't want to have to use one of the other two methods. You want a way to efficiently create a bunch of them. If we jump down and look at this, we can see that with 2 lines we can create 2 hotels if we have a hotel constructor function. So the way that we can create the constructor function is by defining a function, giving it the property, the initialization values, and then we assign values to each of the properties. Now, it's a couple of things to notice about the constructor function is that we use this funny notation, this.name. What this does is it's a special reference that tells JavaScript we're about to reference a property of the object. And then you do that for each of the properties that you're going to set. So once you've created this hotel constructor function, it's just a regular function but with some special sauce, you can then call it any number of times, again using the new keyword, to create new objects of that special type. So this constructor function is called twice here to create 2 hotels. So just to sum up, objects are more complex data types because they can actually have multiple things in them. We call these things properties and methods. Methods are just special types of functions associated with objects. You can use an object, or more specifically the property of an object or a method of an object, pretty much anywhere that you could use a variable or a function. You can do assignments with them, you can use them in expressions. And we create objects in a couple of different ways. Some are simpler, some are more complicated. So explore objects as you work through the book.